At my graduation dinner, my parents gave my sister the CEO title of the restaurant I had run for 11 years. I packed my knives and left. A week later, they lost the $850 Kelvin deal I secured. I said, "Talk to your CEO." "Hi. My name is Amelia Hart, 32 years old, and today was supposed to be my day." The graduation ceremony for my master's in restaurant and culinary management at New York University had just ended, music echoing through the hall as hundreds of square caps flew into the May sky under warm golden lights. I had spent 5 long years balancing the demands of running our family restaurant with countless exhausting nights of study, just to be able to walk confidently across that stage in my deep blue gown. When the announcer called my name, the auditorium filled with applause. Classmates rushed into the arms of their parents, but when I looked up at the stands, I saw only my parents sitting there with blank expressions, their eyes empty of the pride I had longed for all these years. They did not clap, nor did they raise a camera to capture the most important moment of my life. I stepped down with a forced smile and told myself that maybe the celebration dinner later would make up for it. That evening, my family and a few close friends gathered in the luxurious VIP room of Hart's Hearth, the Italian restaurant in Boston that I had built over the past 11 years. I thought it would be a party, just for me, a moment to finally sit back and breathe after a journey paved with sweat and sacrifice. The room glowed with candlelight, crisp white linens draped over the tables, glasses of red wine glimmered under the lights, and in front of me was a plate of pasta made from a recipe I had created in the earliest days of the restaurant, the very dish that kept customers coming back. I sat among friends, colleagues, and Daniel the sous chef who had stood by my side for nearly a decade. My heart flickered with a fragile hope that tonight, my parents might finally give me a word of praise. But everything shifted in an instant. My father rose to his feet, a glass of wine swirling in his hand, and his voice carried evenly across the room. "Tonight, we're not just celebrating Isabel's graduation. We also have an important announcement about the future of Hart's Hearth." I froze, staring at him in disbelief. The future of the restaurant? Wasn't that supposed to be the plans I had spent the past year carefully preparing? My mother placed her hand on Chloe's shoulder, my younger sister, and her face lit up with a rare pride I had never seen directed at me. "From today onward," she said, her voice brimming with delight, "Chloe will officially become the CEO of Hart's Hearth." The room grew heavy in an instant. The laughter and chatter died away. Chloe sat up straight, her golden hair catching the light, her radiant smile making it seem as though this moment had always belonged to her. My friends exchanged bewildered glances. Daniel clenched the napkin in his hand, his eyes burning with fire. I sat frozen, unable to move. My ears rang, drowning out the scattered applause, rising faintly from the relative side of the table. I lowered my head, my fingers unconsciously tightening around the engraved knife that read, "Amelia," a gift I had received in my second year in the kitchen, when the restaurant won its first statewide culinary award. The cold steel pressed into my palm, reminding me that 11 years of effort, of sleepless nights, of unwavering belief had all been swept aside by a single effortless announcement. My vision blurred, my throat locked tight, while my parents stood proudly beside my sister, raising their glasses in celebration. On my graduation day, the one moment that should have been impossible to overshadow had been turned into a stage to hand someone else the glory. And in that instant, I understood. In their eyes, I had never truly been a CEO. I had never truly been the pride of the family. Have you ever experienced the pain of watching your parents grant recognition to someone else while disregarding the sacrifices you made? If you were in that moment, would you choose to forgive, or would you carve out your own path? Before I continue my story, I want to know your answer. Tell me in the comments below. I still remember clearly the day it all began. Back then, I had just graduated in culinary arts from a community college in Boston, holding nothing more than a diploma, a few minor awards from student cooking competitions, and a simple belief that I could contribute something meaningful to my family. My parents Richard and Margaret were already planning for retirement, dreaming of moving into a lakeside home in Maine to enjoy their twilight years. Heart's Hearth, at that time, was nothing more than a modest Italian eatery squeezed between bustling storefronts, its menu plain and its regulars, mostly neighbors from the block. To my parents, whether the restaurant survived or not hardly mattered. To them, it was just a temporary venture, destined to close sooner or later. But to me, it was everything. I saw potential in that place, a flame that could roar to life if only someone cared enough to keep it burning. So while my classmates sought internships at grand hotels and luxury restaurants, I came back, tied on my father's old apron, and began long days with no clear end. From a young and inexperienced graduate, I turned myself into a true chef. By day, I stood in the kitchen, learning how to handle every fresh fish, every slice of imported cured meat, every bundle of herbs. By night, after the restaurant lights went out, I sat in front of an old computer, teaching myself marketing, designing flyers, creating a Facebook page for the place, something my parents dismissed as foolish. When the phone rang early in the morning, I picked up, negotiating with suppliers over every cent of ingredient costs, trying to save money while never sacrificing quality. I became everything at once: head chef, manager, marketer, and even accountant. Many nights, when I finally sat down after closing, my hands were swollen and lined with small knife cuts, but deep inside me was a burning conviction that Heart's Hearth could grow beyond being just a small family eatery. For 11 years, every single day stacked itself on top of quiet sacrifices. I remember in the third year, when the whole kitchen staff was exhausted from the holiday rush, I stayed until 3 in the morning making tomato sauce to be ready for the next day's service. I remember the Boston winters, when snow covered the streets and buses stopped running, yet I trudged nearly an hour on foot just to open the restaurant on time. I remember the nights I worked and studied simultaneously, my eyes stinging in front of a laptop screen as I wrote essays for my master's program, while outside the kitchen filled with the smell of baking pizza. And I remember the first time my name was announced on stage at the Boston Culinary Star Awards at just 26 years old. My white wine crab dish had beaten out dozens of seasoned chefs. The audience erupted in applause, while my parents simply nodded and said flatly, "Fine, but does an award actually keep the restaurant alive?" Step by step, I transformed Heart's Hearth from a small neighborhood diner into a destination featured in local culinary magazines. I signed catering contracts for large events, lavish weddings on the shores of Cape Cod, corporate conferences in downtown Boston, even a charity gala attended by the state governor. Revenue tripled in just 5 years, the staff grew from 10 to 30, and the kitchen was upgraded with state-of-the-art equipment. I knew every brick, every crack in the kitchen walls, every regular customer's exact preference for how much cheese they wanted. Heart's Hearth was no longer just a family restaurant, it was the child I had raised with my own hands. And yet, in my parents' eyes, I was still nothing more than the eldest daughter destined to sacrifice. Every time I heard those words, it felt as if a hole had been carved into my chest. The eldest daughter must sacrifice, Amelia. Your sister is the one with the business mind, it's good enough that you handle the kitchen. They said it so casually, as though it were a law of nature that my efforts were only ever worthy of the stove, never of the CEO's chair. My sister Chloe was different. She studied for her MBA in Boston, and every summer when she came home, she would sit at the dinner table and brag about group projects, about business models she had never once tested in reality. She had never stood in a cramped kitchen for 60 hours a week, never wiped away sweat dripping into a simmering stock pot, never trembled with worry when an important guest arrived late and their food grew cold on the table. But my parents looked at her with shining eyes, while all I received was a pat on the shoulder and the same phrase, "You did well, now keep sacrificing." There is one memory I will never forget. It was my 8th year in the kitchen, and I had just secured a contract with a major company worth more than $200,000. I came home brimming with excitement, eager to tell my parents, hoping that maybe this time they would be proud. But before I could even finish, Chloe cut me off to boast about a group presentation she had completed, one that her professor had praised. Instantly, my parents' attention shifted entirely to her. They bombarded her with questions about the project, about her grades, about her future prospects. I sat there, my glass of lemonade slowly losing its taste, and the sense of accomplishment I had carried with me vanished into nothing. In that moment, I realized with absolute clarity that no matter what I achieved, in their eyes, I would always remain just a shadow behind my sister. The success of Heart's Hearth was built on every drop of my sweat, yet my parents never saw it, or perhaps they simply refused to. They believed it was my duty, while Chloe was the hope. And for 11 years, I swallowed that injustice, convincing myself that one day, when everything grew large enough, when Heart's Hearth truly reached its potential, they would finally acknowledge me. But I was wrong. The very moment they handed the CEO chair to Chloe during my graduation dinner, every shred of that hope collapsed. My graduation, celebration, the one night in my life when I should have been able to hold my head high before my family, was turned into a stage that no longer belonged to me. Just as the main course was served, the lights in the VIP room dimmed, the projector flickered on, and Chloe rose to her feet in a sleek black suit, her hair pulled into a tight bun, the sharp clicks of her heels echoing across the wooden floor. On the screen appeared bold letters: Heart's Hearth, Restructuring and the Future. My breath caught. It was the exact title I had written for last year's strategic plan, but now the plan had been revised and bore Chloe's name in the corner. The room fell silent, every gaze fixed on my sister, while I, the person this evening was supposed to honor, suddenly became nothing more than a spectator. Chloe launched into her presentation with polished confidence, her hands sweeping across slides filled with growth charts, expansion maps, and brand development strategies across state lines. "We need to break away from the traditional model," she declared, her eyes scanning the room with the ease of a seasoned executive. "We need to standardize operations, expand through franchising, and set our sights on becoming the leading Italian restaurant chain in the Northeast." I listened to every word, my chest tightening. These ideas were foreign to the very soul of Heart's Heart, a place where I had poured myself into making every plate of pasta, every glass of wine, every ingredient into a personal experience for each guest. To Chloe, it was nothing but numbers, nothing but a glossy PowerPoint strategy. When the presentation ended, my father Richard stood and clapped enthusiastically. "Excellent, Chloe," he said loudly, his voice brimming with pride. Then he turned to the entire room. "From today onward, Chloe will officially serve as CEO of Heart's Hearth. Amelia will continue as executive chef, focusing on what she does best, cooking." It felt as if an icy blade had been driven straight into my chest. Executive chef? That was nothing less than being demoted, stripped from the helm of the entire ship and reduced to someone confined to the kitchen. My mother Margaret added, her tone sweet but merciless. "You'll always be the heart of the kitchen, Amelia, but Chloe has the business mind. This is the best decision for the family." I sat still, watching it all unfold like a play in which I had been forced into a supporting role. My heart pounded out of rhythm, my ears buzzed. The pasta in front of me had gone cold, the sauce clotted into thick streaks, mirroring the tightness in my throat. Chloe turned toward me, her lips curling into a smug smile, as if she had finally seized the place I had held for 11 years. At last, I stood. No tears, no dramatic scene. Just a long breath, slipping the small engraved knife into my pocket, and a curt reply. "Fine, whatever." The room fell silent. My friends exchanged uneasy looks. Daniel ground his teeth but said nothing. Chloe faltered for a fraction of a second before quickly regaining her triumphant smile. My father clapped louder, as though to drown out the suffocating tension. My mother nodded, her eyes glinting with satisfaction, as if the family had finally gained a real CEO. I sank back into my chair, but deep inside I knew that moment had closed an entire chapter of my life. From then on, I was no longer the partner of Heart's Hearth. I was just an employee, pushed aside, dismissed, and replaced by the sister who had never shed a single drop of sweat in the kitchen. The clinking of glasses, the applause, the forced laughter filled the room, but to me it all blurred together, muffled behind an invisible wall of glass. I sat in silence, watching my family toast to Chloe, while my heart grew colder, knowing everything had changed forever. After that dinner, I went home in a haze, half awake, half numb. Everything had happened too fast, too suddenly, and too painfully for me to react. And as I lay on the small bed in my apartment, the only thought in my mind was that tomorrow I would go back to the restaurant office to pack up my things. If I was no longer the CEO, there was no reason for me to sit in that office for even another minute. The next morning, I entered Heart's Hearth through the back door as I always did. The kitchen still carried the thick scent of tomatoes and olive oil, but to me, the air was different now. My colleagues avoided my eyes when they saw me, unsure whether to congratulate me or offer condolences. I went straight upstairs, to the office that had been mine for 11 years. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open. My desk was just as I had left it, a stack of documents on the expansion plan, a few photos with the kitchen team, and the ceramic mug that read, "Head Chef and CEO, Amelia, a Christmas gift from Daniel last year." My hand brushed against it, and a sharp ache pierced through my chest. I began gathering papers, but when I switched on the computer to retrieve some recipe files, the screen lit up and my inbox appeared. At the top sat an unread email from West Shore Grand Hotel, New York. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. West Shore Grand was the client I had spent 6 months pursuing, a luxury 5-star hotel in Manhattan. I had poured countless evenings into designing a custom menu for them, tasting wines, adjusting sauces down to the smallest detail to strike the balance between quality and the refined palate of their guests. And now, on the screen, I saw the subject line: confirmation of catering contract cancellation. My hand trembled as I clicked it open. The words before me were cold and final. Dear Miss Chloe Hart, we confirm receipt of your notice to cancel the $850,000 catering contract scheduled for this Thursday. While we regret this outcome, we respect your decision to restructure your company's menu. We look forward to discussing potential future alternatives involving cost-effective and mass-producible menu options as you proposed. I stopped breathing for a moment. Restructured menu? Cost-effective? Mass-producible? It was the exact same hollow jargon Chloe had used in her PowerPoint presentation the night before. My vision blurred as I kept reading. They mentioned the exceptional quality during the tasting of Chef Amelia's king crab in tangerine sauce and expressed their wish to preserve that style. But since Chloe had canceled, everything was over. It felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. 6 months of negotiations, of building trust, of adjusting every tiny detail of the menu, all of it vanished because of one email my sister sent in less than 5 minutes. I collapsed into the chair, burying my face in my hands. A wave of dizziness hit me. I had once imagined the day of that signing. I would fly to New York, stand in the West Shore conference room, present Heart's Hearth dishes to executives in sleek suits. I would see my parents proud at last, watch the restaurant's reputation step into a new era. And more than anything, I would prove that you didn't need an MBA, that dedication and talent alone could secure a multi-million-dollar contract. But all of that was gone, wiped away in a single evening after the CEO title slipped into Chloe's hands. I opened a few more emails in the chain. Chloe had written to them. We want to eliminate the elaborate dishes and focus on a more mainstream menu to ensure sustainability and scalability of the model. Reading that, I nearly hurled the mouse against the wall. Those so-called elaborate dishes were my soul king crab with tangerine sauce, cedar plank roasted salmon, truffle mushroom reduction, all recipes I had honed over years. With one decision, my sister had trampled on my work, erased the signature I had carved into the restaurant in exchange for soulless, cheap platters. I staggered out into the hallway, barely able to breathe. Each step felt like I was falling into an abyss. The pictures on the wall, Heart's Hearth's opening day 15 years ago, family portraits with the staff, now seemed to mock me. In every photo, I was always standing in the back, my smile faint, while Chloe and my parents stood proudly at the center. I had once believed I didn't need recognition, that working hard was enough. But in that moment, I saw the truth. They hadn't just dismissed my efforts, they were willing to destroy everything for their blind faith that Chloe was the true leader. I returned to the office and stared at the computer screen one more time. The $850,000 contract, it wasn't just a number. It represented honor, recognition, and the long road I had walked. And now it had been erased. My hand tightened around the engraved knife in my pocket, my palm damp with cold sweat. For the first time in my life, I fully understood that I had lost everything, not to an outside competitor, but to my own blood. I shut down the computer and gathered my papers. But instead of resignation, a fierce fire ignited inside me. I didn't yet know what I would do, but one thing was certain. I would not let this betrayal bury the rest of my life. Just a week later, my sister began her so-called restructuring, and the supplier meeting was the first blow that shattered any illusion I had left that the restaurant could still keep its soul. That morning, the first-floor conference room was flooded with the harsh white glare of fluorescent lights, but the atmosphere was so heavy it felt impossible to breathe. Marcus, the fisherman who had worked with us for 8 years, always delivering fresh catches from Gloucester the same day, sat with his arms crossed, his deep eyes burning with restrained fury. Eleanor, the farm owner from western Massachusetts who had spent her life tending to rows of fragrant herbs and sweet tomatoes I used in my sauces, clutched her coffee cup so tightly her fingers shook. They sat there across from Chloe, my younger sister, in a freshly tailored black suit, her face glowing with confidence as she spoke of scale and consistency, as if those were the only truths that mattered in the culinary world. Starting next month, Heart's Hearth will reduce purchases of seafood from small-scale fishermen, Chloe said evenly. We've already arranged with a major distributor in New Jersey who can guarantee a steady supply year-round, at 30% lower cost. As for produce, instead of sourcing from individual farms, we'll be ordering through Portland Restaurant Supply to receive volume discounts. This is the sustainable direction for expanding the restaurant chain. Marcus slammed his hand on the table. My fish hits the plate just hours after coming out of the nets. You can replace it with factory frozen stock if you want, but don't expect your customers not to notice. They come here for the difference, not for the discount. His voice was hoarse, but it filled the room. Eleanor could no longer contain herself either. The tomatoes I grow on the south slope of my hill get morning sun and afternoon shade. That's why they're sweeter than anything you'll find at the market. I've planted according to Amelia's menus for years. And now you're throwing it all away for the sake of a discount? I couldn't stay silent any longer. I pushed back my chair, rose to my feet, and leaned across the conference table, locking eyes with Chloe. You don't understand anything. People don't come to Heart's Hearth for some bulk-purchased fish of the day. They come for the king crab with tangerine sauce, the cedar plank salmon, the dishes we created together with Marcus and Eleanor. You're killing what made us who we are. Chloe smirked, then turned toward our parents. And just as I expected, my father's voice rang out, sharp and final. Amelia, sit down. Chloe is the CEO. She has the right to decide. It's time you learn to follow someone else's lead. My mother nodded, her tone soft but unyielding. Just focus on the kitchen. That's where you belong. I stared at them, my chest tightening. 11 years of devotion, all reduced to 2 words. Sit down. Ah. When the new menu finally launched, I had already braced myself for disaster, but I hadn't expected it to come so quickly. The king crab in tangerine sauce, the dish that had once won statewide recognition, was replaced by a generic grilled seafood platter. The cedar plank salmon vanished, replaced with a vague, cheap fish of the day of unknown origin. Loyal customers began to murmur. I still remember one night vividly. The Abernathys, who had celebrated their anniversary at Heart's Hearth 8 years in a row, walked in and took their usual table. They ordered my salmon, but the server, flustered, could only say, "I'm sorry, that dish has been removed from the menu." Mrs. Abernathy set down her knife and fork, disappointment written in her eyes, then stood and left without ordering anything else. That scene cut into me like a knife twisting in my heart. Within just 2 weeks, online reviews began pouring in. A respected food blog published an article titled, "Has Heart's Hearth Faded Away?" They compared the restaurant's former creativity and refinement with the bland, industrial approach it had become. Each cold word cut straight into my chest like a knife. Dishes lack character, flavors are ordinary, the unique identity has been lost. I sat there reading line after line, my hands trembling, unable to deny the truth. The restaurant I had poured my entire heart into was now nothing more than an empty shell, driven by Excel spreadsheets and soulless supply chain contracts. Inside the kitchen, the atmosphere had shifted as well. My familiar copper pots were pushed into storage, replaced with rows of industrial fryers. The chefs whispered among themselves, their eyes heavy with disappointment each time they served a dish they knew was substandard. Daniel came to me, his voice low and pained. "I don't recognize this place anymore," he said. I didn't answer, only tightened my grip on the engraved knife, its weight dragging against my hand. I knew this ship was sinking not because of any storm outside, but because those steering it had chosen the wrong course. That day, the air in Heart's Hearth's kitchen was so tense that even each breath felt like knives clashing on a cutting board. The West Shore Grand Dinner, an event that could determine the restaurant's reputation in New York's culinary scene, was only days away. I had prepared for this event for half a year, weighing every recipe, every ingredient, ensuring the menu was both innovative and flawless. But now, everything had been overturned under Chloe's command. On the planning board she pinned to the wall, my award-winning king crab in tangerine sauce had vanished, replaced by a hollow phrase. Seafood medley, cost, efficient, scalable. I stood there, watching my kitchen staff awkwardly unpack trays of frozen seafood that had just been delivered, feeling the blood rush hot to my face. "This isn't cuisine anymore," I said, my voice tight but rising in the room. "This is an assembly line. You're turning this restaurant into a soulless factory." Chloe lifted her head, a cold smile spreading across her lips. "Amelia, you're too sentimental. West Shore's guests don't care who cooks, they care about numbers and consistency. The era of fancy dishes is over." I let out a bitter laugh, feeling as though the last thread inside me had snapped. I pulled the apron from around my neck, folded it neatly, and set it down on the counter. Then I drew the engraved knife from its sheath, stared at it for a long second as if to etch the memory deep into my mind, and slipped it into my coat pocket. I turned to the entire kitchen, my gaze sweeping across the faces I had worked beside for so many years. "If you all want an industrial restaurant, then talk to your CEO." My voice rang out, each word slicing through the thick air. For a moment, silence stretched. Then Daniel, the loyal sous chef who had spent countless winter nights awake with me testing recipes, slowly untied his apron and laid it down beside mine. "If Chef Amelia leaves, I leave too." The sound of fabric hitting the table landed like a vow. Moments later, two other cooks, the grill station lead and the pasta chef, quietly removed their aprons, hung them on the rack, and stood tall beside me. The kitchen buzzed, the rest of the staff exchanging uneasy glances, torn between the fear of losing their jobs and the conviction that I was the true heart of Heart's Hearth. Chloe's face paled, though she tried to steady her voice. "Do you even realize what you're doing? This is a golden opportunity for all of your careers." Daniel met her gaze head-on, his voice firm. "We know exactly what we're doing. And our opportunity lies elsewhere, in a place where quality and dignity come first." I saw Chloe's hand tremble, while my parents stood frozen at her side, silent, as if they couldn't comprehend what was unfolding before their eyes. Just as I stepped out of the kitchen door, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Marcus, the fisherman who supplied our seafood, lit up the screen. "We stand with Amelia. Heart's Hearth is no longer Heart's Hearth without you." A few minutes later, another message arrived from Eleanor. "If you open a new restaurant, remember we'll be there. My vegetables belong only in your hands." I stopped at the threshold, taking in a deep breath. My heart, weighed down for months, suddenly felt lighter. I didn't turn back. I didn't look at my parents or Chloe. I knew that moment marked the end of 11 years and the beginning of something else entirely. The engraved knife in my pocket seemed to burn against my chest, whispering in my ear, "It's time to write your own story, Wine." I left Heart's Hearth with almost nothing in my hands, only the set of engraved knives, a few worn notebooks filled with handwritten recipes, and a fragile belief that I still had a future ahead of me. I didn't return to my old apartment in Boston. Instead, I moved into a small rental in Brooklyn, New York, a place where the constant noise of the city made me feel a little less alone. The apartment was barely 30 square meters, its walls chipped with peeling paint, its windows rattling each time the wind pushed through. But in the corner of the tiny kitchen, I set up an old wooden table, stacked my recipe notebooks on top, scattered a handful of worn-down pencils, and began again from scratch. Each morning, I walked to the local farmer's market, buying a few of the freshest vegetables, a small catch of fish, and returned to experiment. I documented everything, the smallest adjustments, the exact way I seasoned, even my own reactions as I tasted the results. At night, I opened my laptop and drafted the business plan for a new restaurant. I called it Amelia's Hearth, a name that carried the weight of a dream, a fire that belonged to me alone, one that no one could ever take away or restructure. The early days were brutally hard. I ate more instant noodles than proper meals, patched up my own clothes with needle and thread, and took on small consulting jobs in food and menu design just to cover rent. Some nights, I sat staring blankly at my recipe notebook, too exhausted to write a single word. But then I would think about the disappointed faces of the guests who had walked out after Heart's Hearth changed, and my hand would tighten around the pen, pushing me to keep going. One afternoon in July, fate brought me to Jason Mercer. He was a well-known food investor in Portland, hailed by critics as the man with the golden touch, having backed 3 restaurants that had landed on Food and Wine magazine's top 50 list. Jason had heard about me through a mutual connection, none other than Eleanor, the farm owner who had supplied me with produce for years. She had called me with a simple, blunt message. "You need to meet someone. He knows what true value in food means. That one." We met in a small cafe in Manhattan. Jason was in his early 40s, tall and lean, with streaks of gray in his hair, but eyes that were bright and sharp. I laid my ink-smudged business plan on the table in front of him, my hands trembling as I presented. I didn't just talk about recipes, I spoke of the farmers and fishermen who had stood beside me. I told him about Marcus with his 2 small boats, catching only what was sustainable for the sea each day. I told him about Eleanor, who rose at 4 every morning to check on her rows of tomatoes and beds of herbs. I explained that my success had never been measured solely by how good a dish tasted, but by how I sustained the honest, enduring relationships behind every plate. Jason listened quietly, then set his coffee cup down. "You're not just talking about food," he said, his voice deep and steady. "You're talking about values, and I invest in values that last." For a moment, I sat frozen, then suddenly burst into a laugh tangled with tears. In all these years, I had never once heard anyone, least of all my own family, acknowledge that truth. Jason didn't ask where I studied for an MBA, nor did he care how many degrees I had. He saw only what was real, that I had lived and breathed for my fire in the kitchen. A month later, I set foot in Portland. The city carried a slower rhythm but pulsed with creativity, especially in the Pearl District, home to dozens of innovative restaurants, independent cafes, art galleries, and artisan bakeries. I walked down cobblestone streets, past bright glass storefronts, and felt with certainty that this was where Amelia's Hearth was meant to take root. Before long, Jason introduced me to a real estate manager. Together, we visited an old building that had once housed a French restaurant but had stood closed for 6 months due to the pandemic. The kitchen was still fully equipped, the wooden floors faintly perfumed with the scent of aged wine, and wide windows opened onto a bustling street. Standing in that space, I could already imagine the fragrance of tangerine sauce filling the air, the hum of diners' laughter, and I knew I had found my new home. On the day I signed the lease, my hands trembled not from fear, but from the thrill of a new beginning. As my pen pressed each stroke onto the page, it felt like a vow. From this moment forward, I would no longer live in anyone's shadow. I sent a message to Daniel, to Marcus, to Eleanor. Amelia's Hearth has officially begun. If you're willing, let's write this story together. Within minutes, my phone lit up with replies. Daniel was first. "I'm in." No hesitation. Marcus wrote, "My boats will dock in Portland just to deliver for you." And Eleanor added, "This season's tomatoes are ripening. They'll be reserved for your new restaurant." That night, I stood alone in the empty kitchen of my new restaurant, switching on a dim golden light. I pulled the engraved knife from my pocket and laid it on the gleaming steel counter. Watching it rest there, I whispered softly, "We're starting again, from the very beginning, but this time no one can take it away." In that moment, I knew Amelia's Hearth was more than just a restaurant. It was my declaration that I, Amelia Hart, had chosen my own path, and I would walk it to the very end. A week after I signed the lease in the Pearl District, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. The words were short but painted the whole picture. West Shore dinner was a disaster. Guests walked out halfway. Chloe just stood there, frozen. I sat quietly on the wooden floor of my new restaurant, the space still dusted with construction debris, a storm of emotions rising inside me, pain for what had once been my life's work, but also a sharp satisfaction that the truth had finally revealed itself. Hart's Hearth had lost its flame the moment I walked away. The second message from Daniel made me laugh bitterly. "They tried to make your tangerine crab but failed. The sauce was watery, sour, off balance. Guests demanded to see you." Chloe could only bow her head and apologize. I looked down at the table where my recipe notebook lay open. On the ink, smudged page was a note. Orange juice must be simmered low for 45 minutes, with a pinch of roasted zest to hold the fragrance. Those little details, so easy to overlook, were the soul of the dish, something Chloe could never understand. A few days later, while I was working with contractors to refit the kitchen, the glass doors of the new restaurant suddenly swung open. I turned, and my heart tightened as I saw them, my father, my mother, and Chloe, step inside. Richard in his worn suit, his face drawn with a tension I had never seen before. Margaret clutching her handbag tightly, her eyes red and swollen, and Chloe trailing behind in silence. The thud of her heels hitting the floor like heavy drumbeats. I stood still, paint dust on my hands, making no effort to hide the coldness in my eyes. "Amelia." My father spoke first, his voice strained as he tried to hold steady. "We need to talk. The restaurant, it needs you." I folded my arms, leaning back against the newly installed wooden bar, saying nothing, just waiting. My mother broke in, her tone more pleading. "We've thought this through. You and Chloe can share the CEO position. You handle the kitchen and the menu, Chloe handles the business. A perfect combination, isn't it?" I laughed, a short, sharp burst that froze the entire room. I walked to the makeshift desk in the corner, pulled out a thick stack of documents, and dropped it hard onto the wood. On top was a sheet bearing the West Shore Grand logo, bold letters across the page. "Exclusive Partnership Agreement, Amelia Hart, Executive Chef and Founder, Amelia's Hearth. Value, $500,000. I lifted my head and looked straight into their eyes. The air turned to stone. My father stood stunned, his eyes wide, lips moving but no words coming out. My mother trembled, lifting a hand to her mouth as tears slid down her cheeks. And Chloe, the once confident sister, collapsed into a chair, burying her face as sobs racked her body. No one can make the tangerine sauce like you," she stammered between gasps. I looked at her, my heart both aching and detached. "You're right, because you never understood. It isn't just a recipe. It's my soul. And a soul can't be copied." I turned away, walking toward the wide window that looked out over the bustling Pearl District, where the afternoon sun spilled down, painting the red brick buildings in gold. In that moment, I saw clearly the unbridgeable distance between us. Not only because of their failed decisions, but because for years they had never once seen me as an independent person, with dreams, with value. To them, I had been nothing more than a tool, the eldest daughter who must sacrifice. But now, I had severed that chain. "Hart's Hearth is falling apart," my father said behind me, his voice breaking. "You can save it, Amelia. This is the family legacy." I cut him off without turning around. "No, Dad. That's your legacy. And this, I lifted my hand toward the brass sign the workers were preparing to mount on the wall, the letters gleaming. Amelia's Hearth. This is my future. They said nothing more. The three of them stood in that bright room that, to them, felt cold and foreign. When they finally left, their figures fading behind the glass door, I knew a long, tear-stained chapter had ended. And I also knew that from this moment on, I wasn't just leaving Heart's Hearth behind, I was choosing to live for myself. On the opening day of Amelia's Hearth, the sky above Portland blazed with unusual brilliance, as if the entire city was sharing my joy. From early morning, even as I was still adjusting the flower arrangements at the entrance, a line of guests had already formed outside. Many were familiar faces from Boston loyal customers who had abandoned Heart's Hearth with regret when it lost its soul. Others were strangers, drawn here by whispers of the legendary tangerine crab that food critics had written about for years. Inside, the new kitchen gleamed under spotless steel, copper pans glistening, rows of wine bottles neatly arranged on shelves. I stood in the middle of it all, dressed in a crisp white chef's coat, and felt as though every shadowed day of the past had lifted away. The dining room filled quickly, chairs packed, glasses clinking, voices rising in a joyful hum. I moved swiftly through the kitchen, managing the line while keeping an eye on my team, most of them the very people who had left Heart's Hearth with me. Daniel, now executive sous chef, commanded the room with the precision of a conductor. The line cooks worked cleanly, efficiently, pride flashing in their eyes. Eleanor had sent crates of her sweetest tomatoes and bundles of fresh basil, reminding me that they were reserved only for Amelia's Hearth. Marcus delivered fish that very morning, his grin stretching wide. "Just like old times," he said, "except now we're in a place that truly deserves it." My chest tightened, and I whispered to myself that for the first time in years, I finally had a family, not the one bound by blood, but the family made of those who believed in me and chose to walk this road by my side. The press came in greater numbers than I ever expected. Food critics who once wrote about Heart's Hearth now turned their pens toward praising my new restaurant. One major magazine splashed the headline, "Amelia's Hearth, the new flame of Portland's culinary scene." In it, they described the tangerine crab dish as a symphony of sweetness, acidity, and salt, a flavor no industrial chain could ever replicate. Another article declared, "Here, people don't just eat. They feel the love and perseverance of a woman who stood up to her own family to defend what is true." Reading those words, I didn't just feel pride, I felt a piece of the old wound within me finally begin to heal. In less than 6 months, Amelia's Hearth was fully booked almost every night. Customers had to reserve a table a week in advance. One morning, when I opened my inbox, I froze at a letter from the American Culinary Association. My restaurant had been nominated for Restaurant of the Year, the most prestigious award I had once dreamed of but never believed I could reach, especially not after walking away from everything. I sat still in my tiny office behind the kitchen, the letter trembling in my hands, tears dripping onto the page. This was no longer a dream. It was real and it was mine. That night, after closing, I gathered the entire staff and popped open a bottle of champagne Eleanor had sent. I looked around the room, Daniel's radiant smile, Marcus beaming with pride, the younger chefs glowing with passion. I lifted my glass. This award doesn't belong only to me, it belongs to all of us. To everyone who believed in quality, in honesty, in the simple truth too often overlooked. That customers can taste the love in the food. And it's that love that brought us here. The room erupted, voices rising together, laughter and clinking glasses echoing through the kitchen. Yet the moment that struck deepest came on an ordinary night while I was greeting tables. In the corner sat a woman dining alone. Her hair was streaked with silver, her face etched with lines I had known by heart since childhood. It was my mother, Margaret Hart. In front of her was a plate of king crab in tangerine sauce, steam curling gently into the air. I froze, my pulse racing, my hand trembling. For an instant, I wanted to turn away, to leave her there the way they had once left me. But then she lifted her eyes and met mine. There was no indifference, no smug pride reserved for Chloe. For the first time in my life, I saw in my mother's gaze a genuine recognition, the very recognition I had waited 11 long years to receive. She didn't speak. She only gave a small nod, lifted a spoonful of sauce, and closed her eyes as she tasted it. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and in that moment, I knew she had finally felt my soul within the dish. I didn't walk over, and I didn't break that fragile moment. I simply stood still, my heart swelling with something both sweet and bitter. Everything I had once longed for from my family was finally there before me, but it had come far too late, arriving only after I had built a world of my own. Perhaps that belated recognition no longer carried the weight it once would have, but it was enough to let me close that chapter with peace. That night, after the restaurant went dark, I sat alone and added a line to the end of my recipe notebook. Amelia's Hearth is not just a place to cook, it is a place to find myself again. And more importantly, it is proof that once you dare to stand up, the world will have no choice but to see your worth even if your own family once denied it. I set the pen down and let out a long breath, but this time it was one of relief, not bitterness, because I knew I had already won. The night of the American Culinary Association Awards took place in a grand hotel in Chicago, the chandeliers glittering against the high ceiling, the hall filled with tailored suits, elegant gowns, and waves of applause that never seemed to end. I sat in the third row, my heart pounding but not from the nervousness I once felt in the cramped kitchens of Heart's Hearth. This time, I was calm. I had endured enough humiliation, enough bitterness, to know that this moment was no longer about comparison with anyone else. It was simply proof of the journey I had written with my own hands. When the host announced the Restaurant of the Year award goes to Amelia's Hearth, the entire room erupted in thunderous applause. I rose, my hand gripping the hem of my emerald gown, and walked onto the stage with steady steps, no trembling, no bowing my head. The spotlight blazed on my face, too bright to see the thousands of eyes below, but I knew somewhere in that crowd were the people who had doubted me, denied me, and the ones who had believed in me from the very beginning. I accepted the heavy trophy into my hands, gave a small nod of thanks, then turned toward the microphone. I want to say something very simple. I began, my voice steady and clear. Success is not about proving someone else wrong, it's about proving to yourself that you are right. I was right to believe that a dish is not just a recipe, but love, relationships, and dignity. I was right to believe that customers can taste sincerity, and that true value can never be replaced by cheapness or flash. Applause broke out again, but I raised my hand gently, asking for silence, because there was something more important I needed to say. I want to thank those who stood beside me. Daniel, the loyal sous chef who stood with me on the day we chose to leave the past behind. Marcus, the fisherman with 2 small boats, who brought me the freshness of the ocean every day. Eleanor, the woman who devoted her life to rows of tomatoes, who taught me that a seed needs more than soil and water, it needs trust. And every member of the Amelia's Hearth team, who turned our small kitchen into a true family. I paused, letting the emotion flow through the room, then finished. I stand here not because I am more talented than anyone else, but because I chose not to give up. And I hope my story reminds anyone who feels underestimated that your worth does not lie in the eyes of others, it lies in your own belief in yourself. When I stepped down from the stage, the gleaming trophy in my hands, I felt no weight at all. All the bitterness of the past, the graduation dinner stolen from me, the CEO title handed to someone else, the contract cancelled, had become nothing more than rungs on the ladder that led me here. I had not fallen. I had turned every blade of betrayal into fuel to ignite my own fire. That night, back in the small office behind my restaurant, I placed the trophy beside an old photograph of my grandfather, the man who once ran a modest eatery in Boston, the place where I first learned to hold a knife, to taste a sauce, and to understand that food was not just something to live on, but something to live for. He had been gone for many years, but the gentle eyes in that photograph seemed to be watching me still. I touched the wooden frame softly, smiled, and whispered, "I did it." Outside, the lights of Amelia's Hearth still glowed, guests lingered at late tables, and the fragrance of tangerine sauce drifted through the night air. I knew then that I had moved beyond every wound to build a new kind of family, a family of choice, of trust, and of true recognition. This is my story, Amelia Hart. Perhaps you too have faced the moment when your own parents gave their recognition to someone else, leaving your sacrifices unnoticed. If that happened to you, would you choose to forgive, or would you build a path of your own? Tell me, because your answer is also the strength you carry with you on your journey.